Today we're going to talk about cultivation, which can broadly be defined as the maintenance of optimum conditions of growth for your garden plants. This would include such topics as spacing or thinning, weeding, mulching, and I throw irrigation into this general category at the same time. Having a garden is sort of like having a baby. You start off by planting a seed. In this case, in nature's womb, the earth. And that's sort of fun. When the seed sprouts, it's like giving birth. There's a lot of self-satisfied excitement and hope for the future. The real drag of having babies is that you have to raise them up. You nurse them through early illnesses and unhealthy environmental conditions. You have to feed them nutritious foods. They need care to reach maturity, and the same is true of your garden. In order to reach maturity, your garden must be cultivated. If you ignore it, it will die early or grow up stunted and deformed. This is the main problem I've found with my students in the garden. They start out with all kinds of enthusiasm, planting seeds and the first germinations, but when it comes to the boring hard work of cultivation, they tend to lose some of their drive. If you can get through the first little bit, you can get your plants up to a fair size when they can start looking after themselves, then the garden can take care of itself pretty well. Now, one reason I like gardens better than babies is that when they reach maturity, I can eat them rather than vice versa. Cultivation involves providing each plant with sufficient room to grow, with providing each plant with sufficient nutrients and moisture and air and light. It also involves protecting each plant from disease and pest attack. The topic of protection of your plants from mainly insect pests will be the topic of next week's lecture. Adolf Hitler had a word for it. It was Lebensraum. And Lebensraum means living room. Every organism needs space in which to live, in which to grow to maturity. The living space of a plant can be encroached upon by too many of its own kind growing in a particular place, or by other plants which are not, these are called weeds. Thinning is the process of removing excessive numbers of vegetable seedlings. You can throw out, transplant, or eat the thinnings. You probably are going to have to thin on several occasions as the plants grow up and crowd each other out. Student gardeners don't like to thin. They hate it, in fact. Every plant is precious to them. The thought of killing one of their own children virtually send shivers up their spine. As a result, they postpone and they put off and they fudge and they fiddle around and they don't do the job that has to be done, which is massacring most of their offspring so that a few can survive. A couple of days ago, I was talking to a gentleman from engineering, the engineering department here at the university. He was terribly excited about a new invention called hydroponics. And he asked me, how much space does it take you to grow a tomato plant? And I said, well, it takes me 2 feet by 2 feet, about 4 square feet of space to grow a tomato plant. He said, aha, gotcha. I've got 12 tomato plants growing in 1 square foot of space. Well, you just can't grow 12 tomato plants in 1 square foot of space. You've got to give the individual plants sufficient room to grow to maturity. If I've said that before, forgive me, but it's an essential point to get across. You've got to look at each plant and see that it's not touching any neighboring plants. That's the criteria that you've got to follow. At least you've got to follow that criteria until late in the season. Late in the season, they might start pushing against each other, but not early in the season. Now, weeding and thinning are almost always carried out simultaneously. While the seedlings are very small, this will have to be done in a hands and knees kind of operation, especially when working very close to your seedling rows. Between the rows, I generally use a hoe, cultivate with a hoe. The hoe serves the dual function of loosening the surface of the soil and rooting out and killing the weeds. Here are a few hints to remember when weeding and hoeing. You should always weed early in the morning of a hot, sunny day. The uprooted plants will dry out and die during the hot day. When hoeing, you should always work backwards down the row. In this way, you will not walk on the soil that you have just loosened. If you weed late in the day, or on a cool, moist day, and if you walk on the plants you've just uprooted, you will not be weeding, you will be transplanting. The weeds will grow again, stronger than ever. I weed my garden 3 times during the year. The first time is just before seeding. Just before seeding, I go over the bed quickly with a hoe and scrape out any new seedlings that have sprouted up. This is easy. There's no problem in the first weeding. Very quick operation. The second weeding comes quite soon after the seedlings have sprouted. Since we've set down strings so that we have a very precise idea of where we've planted our seedlings, we can use the hoe to cultivate out the weeds between the rows of seedlings, and then you get down on your hands and knees and very carefully pick out all the weed seedlings, and then at the same time thin out the excessive vegetables. About 2 weeks later, this is generally about the middle of July for me, I perform a third and final weeding. I go through and I pick out every weed that I can find. I do a final thinning I thin the vegetables down to the distance that they're going to be in the final garden, and then immediately I cover the whole surface of the garden with a mulch 3 or 4 inches thick. And that's it. No more weeding or thinning for the rest of the season. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no more weeds growing. They do. By late August, the garden is virtually carpeted with weeds, but they don't do any harm. The vegetables stand high and clear above them, and the weeds don't compete with them successfully. Now, maybe here I should say a brief word about just exactly what is a weed. A weed is a plant which isn't where it's supposed to be. In my greenhouse this spring, I have a real weed problem. I've got tomatoes sprouting all over the place. Now, tomatoes are not usually thought of as weeds, but there are a weed in one section of my greenhouse, because these are tomatoes which I threw out last year, and the seeds have survived through the winter in the compost heap, and now with the heat of the subsoil composting, they're all sprouting up through the ground. Many weeds, or what are considered weeds, are quite edible, nutritious plants. A weed generally becomes a weed because it is an extremely hardy, fast-growing plant. This is why it becomes a weed, because it can out-hustle and out-compete the vegetables. Don't worry if late in the season your garden is covered with weeds. I've had ladies come into my garden and sniff and snuff in late August because I've got a few weeds in the garden. This doesn't bother me. In September or October, I'll dig the weeds into the ground and I'll get good green manuring effect from these weeds. Another thing you should think of in terms of weeding is to isolate your garden from the surrounding areas. If you've got pastures or if you've got lawns around your garden, isolate your garden from those areas by putting in a 2 to 3 foot wide path, preferably of gravel, 2 to 3 foot wide gravel path all around your garden. This is a great help in preventing the suckers of grass from growing out from the pasture or lawn across into your garden and starting a really difficult weed pest problem. A gravel path is also a helpful barrier in preventing slugs which live in the pastures and in the grassy areas from migrating into your garden and eating your vegetables. Cultivation also includes providing the vegetables with a suitable soil environment. Now, most of your nutrients will have been worked into the soil prior to planting. But any additional nutrients that you can add through the season will be greatly appreciated by your plants. Nutrients can be added while the plants are growing by irrigating with water rich in dissolved manure nutrients. This is called manure tea, and is made by submerging a brin bag full of manure, it can be fresh manure if you want, into an oil drum full of water and leaving it there for a couple of days. It'll turn the water a rich brown color, and you can use this for watering your plants. It'll be much appreciated by the plants. Or how about side dressing? Side dressing the plants with a nice smelly capelin or fish head or guts. What you do here is you dig a little hole down beside the plant and bury the fish head or the capelin down where the roots can take advantage of it, and then fill in the hole, cover it up with 3 or 4 inches of soil. Pat it down a little bit. If you bury it 3 or 4 inches deep and cover it well, the flies won't get to it. After you side dress with a capelin or a fish head, stand back and watch the plant take off. They really like it. Another approach to fertilizing during the season is called top dressing. This is a method where mineral-rich materials are placed on top of the soil, and the rain washes the nutrients from the top dressing down into the soil where the roots can pick it up. You can top dress with any mineral-rich organic matter, provided it's not going to stink when it decomposes. In other words, I don't suggest top dressing with fish heads. Good materials for top dressing include well-matured compost, grass clippings, seaweed, old hay or straw, brewery wastes, shredded leaves, and so on. Avoid things like sawdust, though. This will rob your soil of nitrogen, and fresh manure, which will burn your young plants. A good top dressing of 3 or 4 inches all over the surface of the garden will act as an excellent organic mulch. Here's the word here, mulch. A mulch is a cover that's put on top of the soil around the base of the young plants. The purpose of this soil covering is to keep down weeds, to maintain soil moisture, and to insulate the soil from violent temperature fluctuations. Ideally, in an organic gardening course, we should stick to organic mulches. But in special circumstances, I have found that a black plastic mulch serves a very important function. This is especially so in permanent plantings of shrubs and trees. Here's a planting of shrub roses. Previously, when I've planted shrubs or young trees, I take a lot of care and I put them in, and then I go away and I have all kinds of other things to do, and by the time I get to look at these plants again, they've absolutely been buried and swamped with weeds, mostly perennial weeds, and there's no way that I can get them out again. So this year I put down a plastic mulch right up beside the plants. The plants did very well, and they didn't have to put up with competition from weeds. This mulch will last for maybe 2 years. It can be taken off by then, and the young trees or shrubs should be able to compete with the weeds for space and light by that time. Last year, in one of my gardens, I ran an experiment to test the different effects of 3 different mulch materials: seaweed, leaves, and straw. Seaweed, which is the dark material, is a very good mulch, but it has the disadvantage of being rather slimy when it rains. This is seaweed, the dark material right here. Next to it is a control plot where I had no mulch at all. And the next is leaves, and the next is straw. Later in the season, I went back to the garden to test how much the mulches had rotted down, being incorporated in the topsoil. You can see the seaweed is still recognizable, but partially broken down. This is the bare patch, the control. The next patch is I put 3 or 4 inches of shredded leaves, and you can see that most of them have disappeared and been incorporated in the topsoil. It rotted down very, very quickly. And the last patch with 3 or 4 inches of straw, and you can see that it's almost totally intact. Very little of it has rotted down to be incorporated in the topsoil. But next spring, I can dig that into the soil and it will rot down very quickly. Some gardeners keep a heavy mulch on their garden all year round. This is called the no-dig method of gardening. In the spring, the mulch is simply scraped aside and the seeds are placed on the surface of the soil, a little bit of mulch put back on, and the seedlings grow up through the mulch. The idea of doing it this way is that you never have to weed your garden. And as long as you don't stamp on your garden, as long as your garden is raised up into beds, you shouldn't have to dig it either, because your soil will remain light and friable. The trouble with the permanent mulch on the garden is that it prevents the soil from warming up in the spring. And if the soil isn't warmed up, your plants won't grow. I had the experience a couple of years ago of going out in close to the end of May with my tiller to till my garden. And 95% of my garden went just fine. I tilled it just fine, but there was one section where I'd thrown a load of manure the previous late fall. I'd thrown this load of manure on the surface of the garden late in the fall after there was a frost in the ground. And in the end of May, this area was still frozen, absolutely solid. I had to scrape all the manure off and let the sun in to warm up the ground. In my garden, I put the mulch on the garden about mid-July. So it has from early spring, when I've dug the previous season's mulch in, until mid-July, the soil is exposed to the sunlight. It sops up the heat and warms up the soil. So by mid-July, I put on the mulch, and this keeps the soil moist, it keeps the weeds down, and it keeps the soil from overheating, which is important. Not too important in Newfoundland, but sometimes it can be important. This mulch stays on right throughout the season. Late in the season, in October or November, if I have lots of leaves, I put on a good heavy coating of leaves on top of the garden. This is known as putting the garden to bed for the winter. So I want to cover up all the soil before the winter time, because that's the time when I'm likely to lose my soil through erosion. In the spring, this big thick layer of mulch is partially rotted down. If I've gotten it on early enough in the season, and if I've gotten it on deep enough, the soil underneath it will have had little chance to freeze. So early in the spring as I can, I dig this partially rotted mulch into the ground and expose the soil for the sun to warm it up. The only other thing I want to say about mulches is that occasionally in August you may get an infestation of slugs, especially around your coal crops. What I found helpful to do then is to pull the mulch back from the base of the coal crops, break the lower leaves off the cabbages and Brussels sprouts, break the lower leaves off so there's an open space around the base of the plant. And you sprinkle lime or wood ashes around the base of the plant, and that discourages the slugs from crossing over and getting to your plant. Now, irrigation is not usually thought of as part of the cultivation procedure, but it is part of the concept of taking care of your plants through the season. So I include irrigation under this section. Now, Newfoundland, fortunately, has an abundance of moisture, but occasionally, usually in July, we may have a 2 or 3 week drought, and if you're not careful, your garden can end up looking like the Sahara, even with this short period of drought. Organic gardeners are in an enviable situation by comparison with chemical gardeners when it comes to irrigation, when it comes to moisture conservation. Because the greater the amount of organic matter that you can get into your soil, the greater the capacity of the soil to hold on to moisture. If your soil is nothing but clay or sand, the moisture will run through or it will puddle out on top, and it doesn't have this holding capacity. The holding capacity of organic matter is much greater than either sand or clay. So the moisture which collects during the winter and spring storms is there and stored up for the drought periods of the middle of summer. Then if you put a heavy organic mulch down on top of the soil in midsummer, this will also protect the surface of the soil from drying out. Last year we had a very dry period in July. The only watering which I did in my garden was a very little bit of watering where I had set new seeds. I wanted to keep the moisture in the ground while the seeds were germinating. As soon as the seeds had germinated, I did no more irrigation. I was asked, well, surely if you have raised beds, won't all the water run out of them, and won't they dry up very quickly? But just to see if I could get through, I did no watering whatsoever, and I had no problem. And a lot of my neighbors had a lot of problem with lack of water. Inside the greenhouse, however, this is a different situation. We water on a continuous basis because there's no buildup of water during the winter and spring, and of course you can't take advantage of the rainwater. If you do decide to irrigate or water your garden, try to remember a few pointers. Water late in the day. If you go around watering early in the morning when the sun is just getting strong, most of the water will go up into the atmosphere and be wasted. It won't get to the soil and the roots where it's needed. Also, it's been found that any little water droplets which accumulate on the leaves can act as little magnifying glass and can actually burn holes in the surface of the leaves. So water quite late in the evening. This will mean that the water will get to the soil and will have a chance to sink down into the soil without being evaporated off into the air. Don't just sprinkle the surface of the soil. You've got to water heavily or don't bother watering at all. Run this little test. Take your watering can or your hose and spray an area for 4 or 5 minutes. It's going to look really quite wet. Then dig down into the soil and you'll find that that moisture has only gotten in 1/4 to 1/2 an inch or so. It takes a lot of water to penetrate that water down into the soil. Now, if you make a habit of watering lightly, just at the surface of the soil, the plant roots are going to be drawn to the surface of the soil to get hold of what water is available to them. This means that they're much more subject to drought damage. If you water deeply, if you get the water deep down into the soil, even by putting a hole beside the plant with a stake and filling that hole up with water, you'll get the water deep down in the soil, and the roots of the plant will go down deep into the soil looking for this water, and you'll have a much stronger plant as a result, and much more resistant to any drought conditions. A little hint that one book told me about last year, which I found rather useful, is to look for the shiny. When you pour water on the surface of the surface of the soil is shiny. And very quickly it goes dull, it forms a matte surface again when that water sinks into the ground. If you can count up between 5 and 10 seconds when that shiny maintains itself on the surface of the soil, this is a good hint that you're probably watering sufficiently. If it sinks in much quicker than that, that soil needs a lot more moisture. This summer, I've given a lot of thought to water supply, as we've had an extremely dry summer. And of course, nowhere has it been drier than inside the greenhouse, where there's no natural precipitation at all. So all the water I supply to the greenhouse, I've got to bring in and lay on right at the base of the plants. Now, for a greenhouse this size, which is 2,500 square feet, this represents a lot of work. So I've been trying to think out ways where I can irrigate the greenhouse with a minimum amount of effort. Also, because there's been so little rain, I've had to worry about my well going dry. So I've tried to arrange things so I don't waste any water. If you take a look at this pipe coming in here, this pipe I've attached up, this is an 1.5 inch PVC pipe, and I've attached that to the base of my bathtub and the kitchen sink and dishwater outlet. So anytime the bathtub or the dishwater or the kitchen sink is used, the wastewater comes down here and goes into this big cement holding tank here. So over the period of 3 or 4 days, there may be 500 or 600 gallons of water, which otherwise would be wasted, which I store in my tank here. When I want to water the greenhouse, I turn on this outlet valve here, and the water is carried down to the plants. Bring the water down to the plants, and then You make little ditches between the plants, and you can run the water down between the plants. This is kind of fun. It reminds me of when I was about 4 years old, and while being very serious and proper, I can play mud pies to my heart's content. We have another form of irrigation which I've been experimenting with this summer. This is something which is used in many arid countries, and it's known as drip irrigation. You bring in a constant supply of water at low pressure into this half-inch PVC pipe, and then with a special little hole maker, you make a little hole in the PVC pipe and insert this micro dripper. And you lay this down between your plants, turn on the water, and the water drips out in a continuous drip of water and soaks the plants right in place. Now, I set this up right throughout the greenhouse, but I've abandoned the use of it because I'm on well water. In order for this to work properly, you have to have the water running night and day. Now, if you're on city water, fine. You can put this on and run it night and day, and just a little bit of water dripping out and continuously irrigating your greenhouse. But if you're on well water, you don't want your pump cutting in and out 24 hours a day. So I've abandoned this, and I'm going to flooding of flatbeds now. That's as much as I want to say about cultivation, and next week I'm going to go on to insect pest control.